The Producer Podcast continues on today's new episode of the show. Last week, I was joined by Chad Gundersen of Out of Order Studios, and today I'm welcoming Chad's producing partner, Chris Juen, to the show. Chris comes with a wealth of producing knowledge, having worked for Sony and on animated films such as The Polar Express and Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. He is now part of the producing team at Out of Order Studios, helping produce The Chosen and much more. So, with that, let's jump in and get started. Thank you, Chris, for taking the time to come onto the show today.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we've never met. I've chatted before with your producing partner, Chad. So maybe just kind of start by sharing your story of how you got started in film and found yourself working as a producer.
Sure. No, let's see. So I've been doing this a long time. I started at Sony Pictures in, 1997. So I started in visual effects. I was actually working nights. So my first movie I ever worked on was Contact, which was directed by Robert Zemeckis. So my job at the time was literally doing tape backups for visual effects. So yeah, the visual effects artists would work during the day, and I would kind of run a render farm and literally back up all this stuff so that in case something would happen. Uh, so that's 97. Then took another project called Starship Troopers. Didn't get a credit on either of them because again, just kind of real low on the totem pole. And then Godzilla, the Matthew Broderick Godzilla was my first screen credit. So on the visual effects side, started kind of moving into more management of people as I proceeded. So was very lucky to work on some kind of groundbreaking projects. The first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man. I did help manage a couple scenes for Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. So again, all on the visual effects side. And then there was a project that came about that was kind of a mix of what we would call animation and in visual effects. And it was Polar Express. Um, and so that was my first experience of working on an entire project. So on visual effects, you're kind of just working on scenes. You don't know how the whole thing's coming together. You're not really involved in the entire process. Well, in Polar Express, so it was motion capture, so it's not quite animation, but we still had a ton of animators. So we were doing that, and I was like, wow, this is fascinating to be able to do the whole movie. And so coming out of Polar Express, at the time we were doing Polar Express, Sony decided they were going to set up an animation division. So they were setting up Sony Pictures Animation while we were doing Polar Express. And so a lot of the principles that we did on Polar Express were kind of introduced into the new animation studio. And so with that, I was like, okay, I kind of made the jump out of visual effects over to animation. So my very first animated project I got to work on was Surf's Up. And then we did Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, one and two. And so anyway, that once I kind of got into that space, the creative aspect of it, the entire, from storyboards all the way through delivery, it was just fascinating. So kind of kept going on that route.
When you got into like the animated films, were you working more at that producer level then, or what was kind of your responsibility on a lot of those?
Yeah, let's see. So I made the jump to kind of a producer on Polar Express. That was the very first. So I was a co-producer on Polar Express. And then from that point on, yeah, so for all the animated projects, it was kind of it's a producer there's so many different levels of producers and so many different varieties of producers. It's one of the most ill-defined titles that I think we have, which I really appreciate. The PGA is trying to put definitions behind things now and stuff like that. But so yeah, in those days, uh, less on it's interesting. I say less on the creative side, but that's actually not really even true because there's so much problem solving. I remember being on with Phil Lord and Chris and Phil from Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, they were our directors, and there's just so much problem solving that takes place. So not necessarily helping them guide the story from a producing standpoint, but it's really kind of execution and getting their vision. They go and figure out kind of what they want. They dream big, and then my role as a producer was to help them, not figure out what they could solve with the money we have, and then also with the time. So.
Definitely. Yeah. I'd be curious to hear just a little bit. So, like, when you're working, say, with them to understand their vision so you can help then execute it as a producer, like, what questions would you normally ask to make sure you were understanding what their vision was?
When working with creatives, I think you really want to push I find it more enjoyable to work with people that are working well outside what they can afford, and that's kind of with the willingness to be able to kind of to scale back, right? So the whole thing is that there's creative problem solving that always happens. I'll give you an example. So you do this thing called a complexity pass. So when you get a sequence of a movie turned over to you and you're kind of looking at it, and we kind of just analyze. Each of the departments kind of look at it and they go, okay, this is how expensive this is going to be. If you remember Surf's Up, or if you've seen Surf's Up, there's a campfire scene, right? And it's three characters sitting around a campfire. Well, when the complexity came back and we presented it to Chris and Phil, they were like, or sorry, not that, sorry, now that I jumped to Surf's Up. So this would be Chris Buck and Ash Brandon on that one. I presented it back to them and they were like, wow, that's a lot more expensive than I was expecting. And I was like, well, you've got just a campfire scene, but then there was the waves were kind of crashing, right? And so every shot had these moving waves, which made it more expensive. So they were like, oh, that's not that important. Like we need to know we're at the beach, right? It's important that we're kind of having a campfire at the beach, but we don't need to see the water all the time. Right. So they were willing to they modified the way their cameras were. Like right. So in other words, rather than shooting straight into the ocean the entire time for half the shots, they kind of shot the other way. So you could hear the sounds of the ocean, but you weren't seeing it every time, right? So it's stuff like that. It's helping them kind of put the money where it matters, from a storytelling standpoint.
That makes sense. So then I'm just kind of curious, did you like always want to work on animated films or like what kind of drew you initially to the visual effects and the animation side of the industry?
Yeah, so again, I always grew up with a love of animation and just movies in general. Um, you get to a certain point and you start going, okay, I enjoyed photography and I enjoyed computers, right? So I have a love of both. And so I'm sitting there and I was just trying to figure out, I'm kind of dreaming and thinking outside the box, like what could I do that could incorporate both? So my love of technology and photography, and that's where the pursuit of visual effects kind of started. Had zero idea. So when I was reaching out, I spent 6 years in the Navy, and I was coming out of my time in the Navy, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And so I started applying to visual effects houses and just was not getting any response. And so I had zero experience and Sony kind of took a chance on me. And like I said, I was working nights, but I even when I started at Sony, I thought what I wanted to do was to be an artist, to sit on to actually be on the computer and actually, execute the shots. And I was given the opportunity to kind of do some more management and solve bigger problems. And I found that was more my gifting, was kind of seeing the big picture rather than sitting in a dark cube, kind of working on one small aspect. It was trying to ensure people had what they needed to get their stuff done. And actually here at Out of Order, our company, that's kind of Chad and I now describe it as is that we like to create environments for people to do their best work, right? And so that's kind of it's just we've kind of made a career out of that now.
So with animated films, I'm curious on like what are maybe some things that people who are producing live action stuff maybe don't have to deal with, or challenges that they don't really have to face, but when you're producing animated projects, maybe that's more common of a challenge or something unique to it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I spend a lot of time trying to teach people animation, right? And so, especially on the live action. So we're working on an animated series right now that the majority of the people on the creative side have never done an animated project. So I'm having to use a lot of live action terminology, from a traditional set. Um, I think one thing that people don't realize is how long it takes, how many people are involved for a long amount of time, and that it happens in a very kind of almost linear fashion. So here's an example. If you're on a set and you have your actors, you have your set, you have your camera, when the AD says action, right? Everything's moving at the same time. Your lighting's already set, your actors are hitting their marks, the cameras are doing their thing, so everything's kind of moving at once. On animation, you go through these phases, right? So you have to storyboard everything. So you gotta figure out your pacing first. Then there's a stage called layout. Layout's like your camera department, right? And so you've got this kind of cat and mouse, or this back and forth that has to take place because you can't just go animate the characters and then shoot them, or you can't shoot them and animate at the same time. So you roughly place a camera and you have this guess about what it's going to kind of do. Then they go and they animate it, and then you have to refine your camera, and then you go into the lighting aspect of it. So it's all this. It's like what happens at once on a live action takes months on in animation.
Okay. Yeah, no, I did not realize
Yeah.
that at all. That's crazy to think about. One of the things that I've heard about before with some of like the animated films, that I've watched and stuff is how they would be using, I guess you could call it kind of like multiple animation studios or like teams kind of around the world. And I was just kind of curious, was that something on the any of the projects you've worked with that you've had to help lead?
Yeah, I think not necessarily multiple studios, but multiple locations. So the studio being all inside Sony, but
Mhm.
having people. We had on certain projects, we had people in Los Angeles, in Albuquerque, and in Vancouver, all at the same time. So
Okay.
not quite as complicated as what you're talking about, because again,
Hmm.
if you're talking multiple studios, there's different what they call pipelines, which is kind of like what's the tool set, how is the data handled, how are things named. So you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of terabytes of data, right? And so how do you keep all that kind of synced? And so it definitely gets complicated. A lot of times what you end up doing on those situations is you'll take so on an animated movie, at least the way we used to do it, you would divide a normal 74-minute movie into like 30 sequences, right? So it's
Hmm.
just like from a storytelling standpoint, just what are some like natural breaks, whether it's because it's at a certain set or whatever, but you're really just trying to dice the movie up into smaller parts, right? And so, if you were going to kind of outsource to a different studio, you would probably look for, to lift an entire sequence, right?
Hmm.
And send it off to them, because then that's like you're keeping them kind of locked to a certain location. Um, if you were going to do multiple sequences, you'd probably want to have common characters, right? So you're not having to export, so again, it's that communication, and really it's the data management of it that becomes a problem. And then from a creative standpoint, you're kind of giving notes to just different people. But from a data management and logistics standpoint, multiple studios can be a pain.
Hmm. Yeah. I can imagine so. Um, because you said, for you guys it was just different kind of locations in North America. Like what did you kind of learn with having to kind of working with three teams, I guess you could kind of call it, in different areas, that remote aspect of work, but keeping a team
Yeah, okay.
in
It's
sync.
interesting. A lot of things changed post-COVID, right? So COVID
Hmm.
kind of changed the dynamic of what you can do remotely. Um, Creative teams still, I think, do better when they're together. Having a director in a room versus on a Zoom call is still ideal. I think some of the things that we've learned post-COVID is, the meetings for multiple sites used to be big conference room to big conference room, right? And
Hmm.
those, no matter how good your video conferencing system was, they're never really ideal because you're like, who's speaking, what's going on, Uh, so post-COVID, I've noticed that a lot of the remote stuff is more like this, right? To where even if you're in the same building, it makes more sense to be engaging like we are rather than in having groups of 20 people in two different conference rooms trying to engage. Um, so, I mean, time zones, actually, I forgot because we did have some work being done in India as well. So time zones is difficult too, right? And
Hmm.
rhythm of views or getting, even if you're only off by an hour or two, the notion of whose work day are you pivoting off of. So again, most of the multi-studio stuff, it really becomes logistics more than it does. And again, other than the outside of it's always better when creatives are together.
Yeah, that's for sure. So one question that Chad said I should make sure to ask you when I talked to him yesterday was on AI, because that so many, everybody in the industry is talking about that. And I, especially with your animation background, I'd be curious to kind of hear your thoughts and how you see like maybe where the inclusion of AI is going to benefit like animated projects and things like that versus where it might be a challenge.
Yeah, I like how Chad kind of punted that one. AI is interesting. I don't think anybody really knows. There's a concept in visual effects and animation called real-time lighting, real-time rendering.
Mhm.
It was a term that we were chasing for a long, long time, right? It was always on the cusp, always on the cusp, and just and I think things have gotten better. I think we're finally there, but I'm talking for 15 years, this kind of holy grail of literally this idea of you moving a camera and the lighting kind of or moving the lights and everything would move interactively, right? And so AI to me is this kind of somewhat brand new technology that I think everybody has these notions of what they think it will be or they want it to be or what they're scared it will be, right?
Mhm.
Um, I kind of take a more, look, I can sit with one of the systems and do, the AI prompts trying to come up with character design. And the interesting thing is that I don't think AI is going to make a producer a character designer, right? Or at least definitely not in its current form. What I'm hoping happens is more that it makes the character designer a better character designer, right? And so the whole thing is it kind of like the computer helped us. I'm hopeful that take it. There's menial tasks that an artist would have to do that if they could do those tasks faster, right? I think that's where we are. Again, I don't think just like I don't think AI is necessarily going to replace the writer, right? I think it can help them. There's tools and stuff like that. My thing that I'm worried about with AI is that it's going to take. I heard somebody describe it the as the fast food type jobs, your low level jobs, right?
Mhm.
Logo design. Like eventually, you would hire a junior artist to go do a logo, right? And he would learn and he'd learn how to interact with people, and then maybe he moves on and gets another job. Or animators, they used to have there's like entry level animators versus your senior animators. I, I fear that the speed at which things are happening, the people who are really good at their craft are going to go faster, but then we're going to lose that training ground, right? So, if you think about legal documents, if a lawyer doesn't want to do some stuff, so they have an intern that helps them do some of this stuff. Well, now if AI helps them do that, then how do you train the young workforce? So I just hope we don't eliminate the training ground for people
Hmm.
because of some of this.
Yeah, no, that I've never thought about that aspect of it, but that makes a lot of sense. In more recent times, you've been, working more on some live action, like with The Chosen and some of that, with Out of Order. I'm curious, like, were there things that producing animated films first in your career kind of helped prepare you for when you made that jump to working on these more recent live action projects?
Yeah, the interesting thing about The Chosen is The Chosen started off so small, I kind of didn't even know where I fit in, right? So I think in the early days, it gave me the space because again, the departments are different, the problems are similar. It's funny. No matter how much money you have, you always feel like you don't have enough money or enough time. Like on the, I just remember the conversations that were taking place early days of The Chosen, and people are like, oh, there's just not enough time, there's just not enough money, and I'm like, just so you know, I've been on $100 million animated projects, and they're like, they say the same thing. There's just not enough time. There's just not enough money. So there's a lot of commonality, even though they're completely different dynamics, right? So again,
Hmm.
it's management from a producing standpoint, from a process, from a communication, from a shepherding teams. There's so much. The shooting aspect of a live action is, especially if you're doing a live action series, is harder, right? The animation is the duration's longer, but it's not as grueling as it can be doing, 14, 16-hour days, you
Hmm.
know, shooting a project for 60 days. Um, but yeah, no, the interesting thing about The Chosen is The Chosen started to grow and get bigger. I actually got more comfortable, right? Because it was like, oh, okay, hold on. Now I can, now, because my brain is, large teams, large scale, large
Hmm.
budgets. So it's been a neat journey for that on The Chosen.
For sure. Um, so just kind of going off of that, I'd be curious, like, would you have like one piece of advice you would maybe give to another producer that like has been doing that smaller size project and now they're kind of making their jump to their first larger scale?
Now, the interesting thing is that I think because we've got a new division that we're starting here, and it's really small, right? So we're
Hmm.
starting we're starting to develop our own projects. And so from a story standpoint, I actually think that when you're running them small, think like you're running them bigger, right? In other words, that's the interesting thing is that in my brain has no choice. I always think bigger than it is, but
Hmm.
like from a communication standpoint, from a mentoring standpoint, right? Like, the interesting thing is that, we have people who have grown into these department heads, like these positions on, so you start off and it's hard to groom somebody that managing a small team, to try to help them on a big team, right? But I think if you're always kind of thinking about that, at least from how you communicate, how you structure things, and how you build teams, right? So
Hmm.
so I think even when I think what happens if you think like from a startup mentality, startups are usually very small crews, and from a business standpoint, and you're doing a lot of jobs. Well, as you start to add those jobs or add other positions, just thinking about, okay, well, where are we going to be when we get bigger? And so I don't know if that's making sense, but I think it's more like you can practice your ideas on smaller shows while thinking about a larger structure. Like, okay, well, how would I do it different if my locations guy and if you've got one person doing multiple jobs, like, what would that, how would that look different if they actually had different jobs, and what would
Hmm.
that style be?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And honestly, there's a few people I'm worried like, oh, I need to go pass that along to them because they, they're kind of at that spot, and it's like, oh, I think they'll really like that.
And
Oh.
I always just encourage people to think bigger. When I got, especially on the faith side, like in other words, a lot of the faith producers, and this is kind of
Hmm.
what made Chad different to me, a lot of the faith producers or people making faith projects were thinking just only how to get to one place. And that one place that, and 10, 12 years ago was how do I get into a direct, make a movie, get it on DVD and get it in a Christian bookstore, right?
Hmm.
And so this notion that people were going to be viewing it at home, right? And so we've spent a lot of time trying to encourage people, no, think bigger than that. Okay, so your story's got to be bigger. Obviously, your budgets are bigger, so there's a bigger um, risk to it, but there's also, getting those into the theaters and getting people out of their houses, right? It's a different dynamic. Especially, when talking about something like The Chosen and Faith, right?
Hmm.
Then it switched to people just wanted to get where they would showcase movies inside theaters. Well, or sorry, inside churches. Certain types of people aren't going to go into a church to watch it, right? So, but a movie inside, a theater is a very neutral place,
Hmm.
right? So, and then what that does is it's easier to invite people in and then have those discussions about things rather than, you know, maybe feeling a little awkward watching a fake film in your house or at a church.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I definitely have seen that over the years with some of the projects I've been a part of and how big or how small they were thinking of trying to go with it.
Well, and where we're focused is the story has to be right. Because again,
Hmm.
just making a project is one thing, right?
Yeah.
But again, at the highest level, I've worked on projects to where we've made them look good, but the story's not good, right? And I think that's honestly one of the things that makes The Chosen so different is how good the writing is, right?
Hmm.
And then it all kind of, again, a lot of things had to align, but with bad writing, you really can't fix it down in the process.
Right. So I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on like the writing side. Like how do you as a producer, how do you know when maybe a project the writing is at that point like this is good enough to now go down the route of actually producing versus either it needs more time to fine tune the script or maybe this project just doesn't have the wheels to go anywhere.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we had nothing to do with the writing on The Chosen. The first four episodes of season one were actually written and sent to us, and it's interesting because conceptually, right, another Jesus project. And I don't know if Chad ever shared this with you, but we actually kind of almost turned The Chosen down, right? Because on paper you sit there and you're like, okay, just what the world needs, another Jesus project. And Chad read the script, the first one. He's like, okay, you need to read this. It's different. And so I think you can. So that's reading somebody else's project. I think for us, when developing a project, you got to be careful not to get stuck in your own echo chamber. Um, you can sit there and you can think you have something really special, and and then you share it with friends and family, and they repeat back to you, and they don't know any better, right? And
Hmm.
so, um, I think some of the best story development, it's actually getting, for me, it's about who's the decision maker. Again, Pixar talks a lot about this, right? So they have the brain trust at Pixar, and so everybody could have an opinion, right, in the brain trust, but then who's the one that's in charge of like picking what they think applies best for what's being developed, right? So I think Pixar did a really, really good job of standing behind its creatives that were in charge, unless it just got to where it just didn't feel like it was working. So, let them handle the low and the middle decisions, right? And then,
Hmm.
but again, if there's a lot of big decisions that you're messing up on, then maybe it's time to change. But stand behind the people that they've got the vision. And I think that's what you've got to be able to do is create an environment where people can speak freely. Again, I say a lot of times that there's no such thing as a bad note. There's just bad timing, right? So
Right.
I'd rather hear almost anybody's note early on, right? Because then you're allowed to kind of pivot and stuff like that. But if you get too far along, sometimes no matter how good the note, it's just you can't change it, right? You can, especially in animation. Remember, I was telling them about all the different stages.
Hmm.
If you're getting towards the end stage and somebody's got a note that would have been easy to fix back here, you wish they had spoken up, no matter who they are. You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
so again, those are some of the concepts that animation has taught me that we've been able to kind of take into other aspects.
for sure. Oh, so then one other kind of bigger topic I wanted to touch on that me and Chad talked about yesterday is like your guys' producing partnership that you have, because you don't always run into that in the industry, especially people that have worked together as long as you guys have. So to start, I was thinking maybe if you just want to tell a little bit of that story of how you and Chad kind of came to uh, connect and go in on Out of Order together.
Yeah, it's funny. So he probably described it probably very similar. So I was in LA at the time, and I started doing this. I was supporting independent projects. It was call it a hobby, if you will. So this idea of kind of looking for projects that I thought were going to be really good and then trying to get them into local theaters. So kind of going to what I was telling you, getting people to think outside of just going direct to DVD. And so one of the projects, there was a studio that Chad had done a project with, and I was tracking that studio. So he had a project, it was a Western. I was lined up and ready to bring it to a theater, and then all of a sudden they just stopped responding. And so what had happened is they'd taken a deal with Hallmark. And so the studio kind of went dark on me. So I was messaging them on Facebook trying to get through them, and Chad sees the message and he ends up reaching out. So his project is kind of what brought us together. But then we just started kind of talking, mostly online, and it got to the point to where the wives were kind of like, wait, who are you talking to, or what's going on there? And so that's why we somewhat joked that we met online and dated for a bit. Um, Chad and I couldn't be. We're so different. You look at us on paper. I'm 20 years inside the studio system, big budgets. He's 20 years independent, smaller budgets. We joke that if it's technology or if it plugs in, he's adverse and I'm all in. And but there's so many commonalities, right? So how we treat people, how we manage, how we want to represent um, to our employees or people that work for us, how we take care of our teams, right? The accountability, it's if something's going wrong, you don't point fingers, you solve it and then you figure it out, right? It's less politics, all those kind of core values. Um, so why the partnership? The partnership, honestly, he and I could do what we love outside of each other, and we did it for a long, long time without each other. Um, we've come to the belief that we think God has kind of brought us together and that we're stronger together. So we can do, there's almost nothing we can't do. I remember the first independent project that we were getting ready to do. And, I come from a big studio, so we had a department of lawyers. And so, the first legal document comes in and I go, okay, well, all right, who do we send this to? Like, how do we make sure we're good? And he's like, well, you and I are going to read it over. We're gonna get it. We're gonna answer everything we can, and we're gonna give our 5 questions, and we're gonna call this lawyer over here, and we're gonna get them. We get them answered. So he's taught me in the early days the independent mindset, the doing more with nothing, and then now as the chosen is scaled, right? Now it's like, okay, now I'm like, okay, I got this. We're good. And let me help you out. So it's one of those we're definitely stronger together things.
So I guess I'd be curious to hear like how did you know like starting that partnership with him was the right move for you at at that time in your career as opposed to something that you should have passed by?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a God thing. The interesting thing is that he and I hit it off when he came out to LA. He ended up meeting with my wife, and we all everybody was just kind of gelling. And then we got the families together. So the kids were young at the time. I think our oldest were 10 when they met. Um, Everybody there was a harmony about the whole thing. So it's interesting because you look at it now and you're like, oh, okay, well, wow, we share bank accounts and we've bought property together. We've done, meaning our office building. Um, it's just always kind of felt right. I think one of the interesting things is the very first project we were on. I felt like the people that had hired us almost were kind of trying to divide us, right? Like, so I feel like we were kind of tested very, very early on about our resolve. So I think you become stronger through some of that adversity, right? And so I think early on it was confirmed that I think the way he describes it, and it's a good way to do it, is he's always he always feels like I've got his back, right? And that I'm putting his interest above my own, and then he does the same to me, right? And so I think if you approach it like that, it's less about there's no competition, there's no, it's again, we're just looking out for each other and each other's families, and we take that very serious, right? That what we're doing, there's been times where we're both not on a project. COVID was interesting, right? So live action stuff stopped altogether, and I landed a consulting gig with an animation company, and so the only income coming in to the company, and again, we've always had this mentality that whatever money comes in, we run through the company and we split it, and regardless of where it's coming from. So there's been challenges. But like with anything, I think there's intentionality, right? We check in with each other, right? Making sure, hey, you still good? Any concerns? And because I think without that, you can drift.
Diving in just a little bit more there since you brought up like your family and that. Um, I'd love to hear just a little bit more on just how you guys manage working in this industry whilst having families, because that's not always the case. Or for a lot of people, even if they have a wife or kids, it's not always the greatest home life while working in this industry.
Yeah, no. And let's not kid ourselves. It's not easy. So when I was in animation and visual effects, at least I would come home every night. You know what I mean? So they were long hours, it was long commutes. So again, but it was still present every day. On The Chosen, we spend about 4 months kind of away from our families. We see them, during some of that time we're home on weekends. There's some traveling, obviously, but it's been a grind. Um, my family kind of approached it as we would evaluate it every season, and make sure it kind of made sense. We view it as is that it's a family sacrifice, like in other words, so we do our best to try to reward, when the celebrations happen, it's important that the kids see the impact. I think it helps. Again, I've never, we'll see, but the fact that The Chosen is a worldwide global phenomenon that is impacting lives, I think kind of makes that struggle worth it. Like if you were doing, the 17th, James Bond movie, that may not have the same, that may have a different impact on the family. But it's not easy. When people ask us, at least me in particular, how can I pray for you? I'm like, pray for my family. Pray for the unit to maintain strong. And like I said, I think it takes some intentionality. We're still trying to figure it out, the balance and the reentry. You're gone and the house operates without you. You come back, and the whole reentry aspect of it. So it's getting better, but it's life struggles happen while you're away, and people feel alone. And my wife is she not only runs the household, but she homeschools too. So she's, it's a brutal sacrifice, even if I was there, you know.
Yeah, that's for sure. So I guess one other question I had on like the partnership aspect is like, what would be a piece of advice you would give to a producer out there if maybe they've found somebody that they're considering entering a producing partnership with, like you and Chad have?
Ooh, that's interesting. It's funny. It kind of felt right from the beginning, but it's interesting. Ever since we've had a lot of people who've had partnerships that see how Chad and I interact, and they tell us their horror stories, and I'm like, oh gosh, okay, So there's an aspect of it's funny because my wife and I got married really young. We got married at 19 and 20, and we didn't have our faith was really non-existent. And so you sit there and you go, I feel like God was like I look back on it now, like, okay, God was involved in my marriage early on. And so there's an aspect I think that God was definitely involved in our partnership early on. I think it's why are you becoming partners, right? And again, I think we um the the core of who we were so such in common, right? That I think it made sense. I think sometimes people do it out of business reasons, right? And so again, it's like, what's that driving force to the why? And honestly, if you don't feel like that person's got your back over his own, then that's probably not. Like I think that's probably the main thing that is a difference maker for us. I never have to worry if I'm not in a room or he's out doing something. I know he's always got my best interest, right? And so when you can rest in that, then I think that makes because you're going to have issues. There's going to be ups, there's going to be downs, there's going to be good projects, there's going to be bad projects, and we've had them all, right? And so it's not it's kind of like in a marriage. It's not if you're going to argue, if you're going to disagree, it's really how you're going to resolve it. And so there's something there with the notion that of having each other's back that makes the fact that we know that we can resolve it. So I think to me, it's more about that. It's less about, so it wasn't a financial deal because there was no money. It was all just, kind of two guys having each other's back.
Yeah, it's crazy looking back even for myself on things where it's like, oh yeah, that was definitely God having his hand in things that I had no idea
Yeah.
was was him doing things back then. Oh. So I have kind of two final wrap-up questions for you here. The first one, kind of jumping back to animation, is just if there's people out here listening to the show that are interested in getting into animation, like what would be a piece of advice you would give to them?
The interesting thing, especially if you're in the US, a lot of the animation work, unfortunately, is being done overseas. Vancouver's huge. The truth of the matter is, I think there's people that view entertainment in general as this kind of glamorous aspect, right? Like, in other words, and it's really the majority of it isn't, right? And I think if you've got a passion for animation, the interesting thing is there's so many tools between like Blender. Blender's free, and there's so many aspects of there's pros and cons to it from a studio standpoint, but you can learn so much. There's Maya if it's actually inside if you want to animate characters. I think Maya has ways of getting free licenses or at least educational licenses. There's so many the computers we have. When I started nobody could do this at their home in their home. Now you can, right? And so there's a guy in my church, the pastor's son was literally on his phone the other day and he was kind of modeling and texturing, in 3D on his phone, right? And again, so I think if you have I think this applies to anything, not even just animation. If you have a passion for writing, you should be writing, whether somebody's viewing it or not. If you have a passion for animation, you should be developing like and just doing stuff, even if it's outside of like not at a big studio, right? If you have a passion for producing, you should be shooting stuff. You should be, assembling teams and getting stuff done. So I think it's the pursuit, no matter, I think a lot of people are like, oh, I can't get a job. Well, no, there's so many things you can do just with the gear you have at your house these days. Start there, start a YouTube channel, get going, get recognized. There's almost no excuse anymore. Especially if you've got this highly creative spirit, you just pursue it, right?
Yeah, that is for sure. Yeah, it's crazy even what was available when I was getting started, like the digital camcorders for people to have just for home movies were like just starting out at stores and
This is 4K,
I know.
right? I mean, and we joked that for the longest time on The Chosen, we weren't even shooting in 4K, right? And so I'm like, you've got to, in essence, outside of lenses and a whole bunch of other stuff, but I'm like, from a resolution standpoint, you've got something in your pocket that there's no reason not to do something.
Yes, it's crazy. Um, so then my final question for you is if there's like one thing that you know now as a producer that you wish you could have known back on your first project, what would that have been?
Oh, that's a good question. I think especially back then, have fun. Like my first project uh producing, I just taking it so serious, right? I mean, the whole thing is, I remember, so I'd already been doing a bunch of stuff before this, but 9/11 hit, and I remember driving into work and just thinking about the world and everything like that. I'm like, you know what? I make cartoons for a living, right? And so, um, and so I mentioned, from Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, Phil Lord and Chris Miller. Um, I feel like they taught me what an animation studio should be. Like you should be having fun and enjoy it. I think if you're gonna work in film in general, like I think or it's a creative space, we're very blessed to be able to do this. So I think enjoy it, and not only just for yourself, but appreciate everybody around you, right? And get everybody to kind of enjoy it. Because again, it's to be able to do something you love and make money at it. It's just not worth it if you're not having a good time.
Yeah, it's probably something I could try to do a little bit better at times. I
It's
probably
not easy.
get a little too serious myself on projects.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not easy.
We will go ahead then and wrap this episode of the Producer Podcast up. But thank you once again, Chris, for taking the time to come on today.
Oh, this is great. It was a great conversation, man. Appreciate it.
With that, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Producer Podcast. Come back next week for another can't miss episode of the show. Until then, make sure to check out our new website, theproducerpodcast.com. I'm your host, Micah Versman, and thanks for listening.